So today's workshop is Vermont's Education Transformation, Impacts and Opportunities for Special Education. And I'm really pleased to introduce you to Meagan Roy, who is the coordinator of school leadership programs at St. Michael's College. Meagan has been an educator and leader in Vermont since 2002. Previously, she served as superintendent of the Washington Central Unified Union School District, and she also spent more than a decade in the Champlain Valley Union School District as their director of student support services. Meagan began her Vermont teaching career as an intensive needs special educator, and her professional endeavors are deeply linked to her beliefs about social justice and the need to ensure that public schools can serve all students. Meagan is deeply invested and engaged in education policy work at the state level and has a particular interest in policy implementation at the local level. She is a past president of the Vermont Council of Special Education Administrators, and she served as the chair of the Commission on the Future of Public Education in Vermont. So thank you all for joining us today, and Meagan, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Krista. Thanks everyone for being here. Appreciate the introduction. I will have to say less about myself when it's time. So I'm going to share my screen and put some slides up. All right. So again, welcome. Appreciate folks being here. We had lots of conversation about when the best time would be to have this presentation, because as you'll see, the legislative process took went longer this session than anticipated. But hopefully what I will do today is talk with you a little bit about the education transformation journey. Some things were set into motion quite a while ago, and I want to kind of share a little bit about that. And then I will give a summary of the bill that was just passed. And then talk a little bit specifically more about the implications for special education, because I think that's why most folks are here. And obviously this is pretty enormous legislation and has some wide-reaching implications for education in general. And then we'll be specific about special education. As Krista said, there will be time for questions, and some folks shared questions in advance. I may get to those just in the course of what I'm sharing, but if not, feel free to ask again. So again, I don't need to spend much time here. I am at St. Michael's College now, and most of my career, though, has been spent in special education. And I have spent time as the chair of the Commission on the Future of Public Education. I will talk a little bit more about that, but that's me. So I always like to start conversations in Vermont with reminding us that Vermont is one of the very few states where public education is part of our Constitution, and the state's responsible for providing public education. That sounds like that would be something that was common in states across the country. It is not. And our law specifically talks about providing educational opportunities that are substantially equal. And that is supposed to ground all of our conversations about education transformation. I also wanted to share, I don't want to pretend that this year or this past 12 months is the only time that Vermont has been talking about transforming public education. It's not. But specific to the law that was just passed, our time frame has been pretty short. And anyone who's read the news and stayed in tune with this might already know some of this, but just about a year ago, actually a little more than a year ago, education was in the news a lot, specifically about property taxes. We had a culmination of a lot of things within school districts with recent education legislation, and a lot of other cost drivers that some of which have nothing to do with education, that caused the cost of education in Vermont to spike. That resulted in a lot of failed school budgets. Many of you may be in districts where your budget failed, sometimes more than once. Schools had to respond to that by making reductions and cuts. And because of that, the legislature set some things into motion to respond and to transform education. And at the time, they did that by convening the Commission on the Future of Public Education in Vermont. It's a very lofty title. It was a lofty list of things the commission was meant to do, but they put that group together, and it was made up of, for good or bad, it was made up of educators, legislators, sort of people within the education world. And it was meant to study this issue and to, I'm going to talk in a little bit more detail about what it was responsible for, but that was their response, is to say, we've got some things that need to change in education, and we want to convene a group outside of the political process to be able to make recommendations. Around January of this past year, the governor shared a plan for education transformation, and I would say that kicked into motion the conversation within the legislature about what to do about that. And that is where H454, that's how I'll refer to it, that's the law that was just passed by the House and Senate. That's what set that into motion. And just a week ago, yesterday, the passage of H54 happened. I didn't know if by now we would have a governor's signature so that it would be an official act. He has not yet signed the bill, but he has communicated that he intends to. So that's been the transformation journey. I won't spend a lot of time on these slides. I think they will be distributed after the fact if you want to read through in more detail, but it can be helpful, I think, for people context-wise to know that the legislature convened a commission to study the issue of education in Vermont, and it was prompted because of the cost. That's very clear. That's what set this into motion. But the charge of the commission was much broader than looking at the cost of education. They were meant to make recommendations for a statewide vision to make sure that that original intent of the law is in place for kids in Vermont. There's a series of bullets. We were responsible for developing a work plan, developing a community engagement plan. So the commission was meant to engage with the public and with various stakeholders, including families and caregivers of students with disabilities as one of the named stakeholders that we were supposed to consult with. And the intention was first to provide a preliminary report in December, and then December of last year, 2024, and then draft recommendations for public comment by October 1st of this coming year, and then essentially deliver a report to the legislature in December of 2025 with recommendations. And then we would cease to exist at the end of the year. So that was our original charge put into place in 2024. When the commission kicked off its work in July, they felt that it was really important to define what are the principles through which we would make our recommendations. And first, we acknowledge that, again, in Vermont, the state is responsible for public education. Our system currently delegates that responsibility to local communities and local school boards. That's the model we have, but the state is ultimately responsible. And that's pretty relevant in this conversation. We also wanted to make sure that we committed to decision-making that centered equity and sort of defined equity as understanding that equity doesn't mean the same, doesn't mean everyone gets the same thing, that sometimes solutions with an equity focus are differentiated based on need, and that equity is considered both in terms of inputs, what students receive in support of education, but also equity is about outcomes and whether or not students are achieving what we want them to achieve. We had a focus on quality and making sure that all students are afforded high quality education. The language here in this slide, it comes from our state board rule. So in Vermont, schools are supposed to provide this. And then we did have a guiding principle of sustainability and affordability. We knew that we were put into place because of the cost of education. And sustainability is really important to the system. We have to be able to sustain what we're doing. The commission made some preliminary recommendations in December. Those recommendations were not cost reduction recommendations, although we were asked to look at that. The commission ultimately decided that there really aren't short-term solutions to this, because the challenges that education faces are bigger than that. What we did acknowledge is that there are three primary areas that require change, frankly, in Vermont. One of them is the finance system, how we pay for education. One of them is how we govern and make decisions and administer education. So that is governance structures. And the other is quality, that we have delivery systems that may or may not be achieving the quality that we want. And so our report really said to the legislature in December of 2024 that it's really important to address all of these things. So in about January, the commission was sort of, I would say, forced to change its focus. And that's when people will remember that the governor and the Secretary of Education delivered their draft proposal to the legislature. I would say, as the chair at the time of the commission, that had a destabilizing effect on the commission's work. It really caused us to say, okay, now what do we do? Is our job to respond and provide input? Is our job to keep going and generate alternative recommendations? So we had to pause and reset and figure out what was what would be the most useful thing for the commission to do. And so we pivoted and we decided that the best thing for us to do is to try to put ourselves in a position where we could provide real-time reaction to the things being considered in the legislature. That was hard. I will tell you that was difficult because a commission that meets once or twice a month isn't going to be able to respond to discussions happening on a daily basis in the legislature. But our goal was to try. We wanted to continue working with our community engagement consultant. We had brought in a consultant to say, how do we make sure that we bring voices into this conversation that are not sitting around the table? The 13 members of the commission can't possibly represent all of Vermont, and we needed to focus on bringing that input in. And so we decided to keep working on that. We also started to look at folks may have heard of a tool called an equity impact assessment, which really looks at any kind of policy development and says, how does this impact various populations, particularly historically marginalized populations or people that aren't finding success in our systems? How are they going to be impacted by potential policy? And so we started to look at the things being discussed in the legislature through that lens. In June, so as part of the new bill, the commission officially has a new revised charge, and it is responsible for doing 4 things. The first is that it is responsible for, this is very legal language, it's cut and pasted from the law. It's responsible for determining what role, function, or decisions should be locally determined and which should be state level decisions. They are responsible for providing updates to the roles and responsibilities of school boards and those that elect them in this new world. Some of this will make a little bit more sense when I overview the law. They need to make recommendations about how a community who may be served by a school a community that's considering closing a school, how they would have voice in that process. And the commission is responsible for providing a plan or making recommendations for how they will monitor implementation of H454. I will say I'm no longer the chair of the commission. I will be kind of focusing on the work in a different way, but this is what the commission is responsible for doing moving forward. So all of that is a little bit of just background information because I think it's helpful just to know the journey the legislature was on. The legislature did the work of developing this law on through its legislative process. So the original intent was that the commission would make recommendations to the legislature, and that's not really where it landed. And I think that context is kind of helpful to know how the bill originated. So where are we now? So now I'm going to go through each piece of H454. I want to be really clear. The bill is 155 pages long. There's a lot of information in there, and a lot of it's pretty technical. There's entire sections on tax code and things like that. And I am going to try to hit in a pretty understandable but bite-sized way the key parts of the legislation. That means I'm going to miss a lot of detail. The materials that get sent out to you, if you are interested in reading the whole bill, it'll be linked, so you'll be able to access it. And if questions come up, I may be able to go deeper, and there may be certain places where I won't be able to go deeper. So just want to be clear about that. And then I also wanted to say, and this is sort of a disclaimer, I could have said this at the beginning, I bring a lot of hats to the conversation. So does everyone on this screen. And I know I have thoughts. I have thoughts personally. I'm a parent, right? I have thoughts professionally about the legislation. And I'm going to try really hard to summarize this for you so that you have information about it. If there are places where sort of it makes sense for me to share my professional opinion about something, I will do that, and I'll tell you how I'm doing it. But I just wanted to share that I've been very deeply involved in the process, and I'll try to keep those things separate. So I also have to move or my light will turn on. So apologies for that. At a very high level, here is what H454 does for Vermont, or sets into motion. The first is it sets the stage to create new and larger school district governance structures. This is one of the biggest pieces of the law. So starting in a week, starting on July 1st, there will be a task force convened, and that task force's job is to recommend 3 possible options, no more than 3 possible options for new district lines. So the thought behind this is to create scale, to increase the size of school districts in Vermont. In the law, it says to the extent practicable, the task force should be aiming for districts that are between 4,000 and 8,000 students. Related to this, there will be a separate and somewhat parallel working group that's convened to determine voting wards for each of these new districts. So you can imagine right now, school districts are largely community-based. So the school board is made up of community members. In a district that is much bigger and spans multiple communities, there needs to be a determination about how to make sure there's equal representation on those new school boards. Not unlike the representation for the political process itself. And so there will be a separate working group that takes the recommendations of the task force and determines possible school board representation in those new structures. That by itself is an enormous change in Vermont, and mechanically there are a lot of steps involved. Anyone who knows that in Vermont, we had a voluntary school consolidation a number of years ago, and we had lots of smaller districts who chose to move into bigger districts. And even just the process of voluntarily becoming a single district is challenging. Everything from finances to how you make decisions is different. So this is a big endeavor, and I'll talk about implications specific to special ed a little further down. I would also say this is one of the things that's the most unknown in this legislation. We don't know what district sizes, what configurations will be recommended by this task force. We also don't know what the legislature will actually do with those, because it's not the task force that would make the decision, it's the legislature. So there's a lot of unknowns with this piece, and you'll see in a second, a lot of the rest of the law hinges on the development of these new structures. So I'll talk about that in a second. H454 has creates a requirement for minimum class sizes, average minimum class sizes. Vermont's education quality standards already has maximum class size averages recommended for school districts. School class size is not supposed to be any larger than what's in the ed quality standards. This adds a minimum. There is no class size minimum for kindergarten. The average minimum for first grade in a district would be 10. For second through fifth, basically elementary school, it would be 12. Sixth through eighth middle school would be 15, and high school would be 18. Couple things about this. They're averages, right? So an individual's classroom within a school may periodically dip below the minimum, and it would be the average for the school. Any action that came out of not meeting the minimums happens after you fail to meet the minimums after 3 years. So there's a long time because that, enrollment fluctuates in Vermont. It always has. There are exemptions for a number of things, and this is important. One of them is any kind of special education service or an intervention service outside. So a literacy group, a math group, a social learning, social thinking group. Those are exempt. Those are small by design. They need to be there to meet the needs of kids, and those would not be counted in a district's class size minimums. You or a school would be able to apply to the Secretary of Education for exemptions or waivers. The secretary would have to develop a process for that, but there is an ability to say, we have small classes and we can't control that. So they're small by necessity. And then the secretary would intervene if you failed to meet the minimums for 3 years in a row. The Secretary of Education already has the authority to intervene for school districts who don't meet education quality standards. So that part is not actually any different. This just adds class size minimums to that process. Okay, the next biggest thing that you are probably hearing about, although I would say my editorial aside is it's all big. This is a big change. We would change our funding system in Vermont. Right now, local school boards, local administrators recommend to their school board, and then their school board recommends to the community how much it will cost to educate the students in that system. Because we have a shared funding system, all of us share in the funding of those budgets, but they are locally decided. In this law, we would shift to a foundation formula. So the concept of a foundation formula is that school districts would receive a foundation amount that is the same. They would also, on top of that amount, they would receive associated weights for certain categories of students that there's an identified and recognized need for more money to educate them. I'm going to talk a few slides from now more specifically about the weights for special education. But some of those categories are special ed, English language learners, economically disadvantaged students, so students who live in poverty. There would be added funds to that base amount. But once that amount was determined, and it would be determined by the demographic of your school district, then you just receive that amount from the state. It would be raised by taxes, but you would receive that money just based on your student body. Communities no longer develop a school budget and vote on it. There is a measure in here that allows communities to raise additional funds beyond the foundation amount. There's a lot of technical information about what that would look like, and the ability to raise funds starts high and then goes down over time. And the amount is still limited. So for example, in one portion of the journey, a district can say, I would like to spend 5% more than the base amount. So there is a mechanism for that, but it's not open-ended. Really important to know, the funding formula does not go into place until the new districts are operational. So one of the things that's happening right now is a lot of school districts are taking the foundation formula and modeling it in their own system. And that's not really how it will be modeled, right? Because the district size will be different. And we do not, as a state, shift to this funding model until we are operating different district structures. So it's contingent. I'm going to keep going. It's a lot of information here. It feels funny not to pause, but there will be time for question. In 454, this is very relevant, and I'll talk about this in more detail, but the Agency of Education is being asked to conduct an extensive study of the delivery of special education in Vermont and develop a strategic plan. My understanding from listening to this process or to these conversations is that this is already in process on the part of the Agency of Education. And there's quite a bit in the law that describes exactly what this report needs to look at. That's not in this slide, but it is in the full text of the law. But it's really looking at what's the current state of special ed services in Vermont. And it will make recommendations to change structure for service delivery, the practices that are used, and potentially if there are recommendations for changes to the law. Specifically, the agency has been asked to look at the rise in extraordinary special education costs. So that's the cost for individual high-cost students in Vermont has gone up significantly in the past number of years. And so the law requires that they look at that. That by itself is a very big study. This study is actually due, you'll see this in the timeline, this is due this coming fall, the report and the strategic plan a short time after that. So that is in the new law. This slide has sort of it's like a summary scattershot of a lot of the other things in the law. Again, not everything, but some pretty important things. There's a lot of conversation happening around school construction. And so the new law convenes creates a state aid for school construction program and an advisory board, but it does not have money attached to it. So there is a language in the law that says the general fund, there will be an amount of money put into this fund, but it doesn't say how much money there is. So this will talk about things like how does a school apply for state construction funding. Some people may be aware that Vermont paused its statewide support for school construction quite a number of years ago, which means there's no state funding, it's all locally raised. The reason this is important is because some schools cannot merge into bigger structures unless they build, either by renovating or by building new buildings. We also have a pretty significant school infrastructure problem in Vermont. A lot of our schools are aging, they need work, there's not a lot of money. When it's hard to pass a school budget, you tend not to ask for more money to fix your building. So that's what this is for. 454 requires study and implementation potentially of a number of things that are kind of related to being more coherent as a state. We are very distributed in terms of decision-making about certain things. So this law requires the secretary to make recommendations for a statewide school calendar, statewide graduation requirements, statewide finance and student information software system, so kind of the technical operational things. The calendar and the graduation requirements are probably the most salient to special education. The 454 changes the appointment structure for 2 members of the State Board of Education. Right now, everyone on the state board is appointed by the governor. In the new law, 2 of those people would be appointed by the House and Senate. There's some more studies put into motion. One of them is studying how pre-kindergarten should be funded in a foundation formula, how the foundation formula should change over time. That's the inflationary measure. So how do you account for just costs going up? Because no longer will your local school board make that decision. That has to be baked into the foundation formula. This also asks for just revisions in general to the foundation formula. There is an amount of money in the new law for how much schools will receive. There is a new foundation amount and weights, but because it doesn't go into effect right away, the legislature is asking to make sure that we study that so that it's the right amount of money. One of the things that will be studied is whether or not special education weights, as they're currently defined, is the right way to fund special education. So that is an open area of study. And there's quite a number of changes to homestead property tax categories, including the addition of a non-homestead residential rate. There's a lot here, but essentially in Vermont right now, there's only two rates. There's the homestead rate, which is what you pay on the property you own and live in. And then there's the non-homestead rate, and that covers a lot of categories. So there's an additional category in here. Quick implementation timeline. There's a lot of due dates in this new law. The things that go into effect right away, so basically July 1, is they convene the redistricting task force and it starts to do its work. The voting wards task force starts to do its work. The agency reports on the school calendar and graduation requirements. That starts immediately. And the agency report and strategic plan on special education happens this coming school year as well. So those are the things that are set into motion right away. In July, starting July 1, 2026, that is when the class size minimums go into place and all the compliance that goes along with that. Remember, anything happening associated with class size minimums doesn't happen until 3 years, not meeting it for 3 years. So there's a pretty long tail of implementation, but the requirement goes into effect next July. The school construction aid task force is convened starting July 1st. 2027, July 1, 2027, they will start to calculate and collect data on property tax rates with the new categories. And that's because by then there should be an idea of new districts. By the way, the new districts, the intention is that we would know what those new districts would be in that July 1, 2026 timeframe, because the legislature will have taken action. They won't be operational yet, but you'll at least know where you're headed. And then July 1, 2028 is when the new district structure would assume responsibility for students. And that's when the foundation formula would go into place. One of the questions that we got in advance was about when the special ed funding actually changes. And this illustrates that. So the special ed funding will be received the way we currently receive it until the new districts and the new foundation formula go into place, which would be not before July 1, 2028. And it might be further out if districts are not operational yet, but the soonest would be 2028. Okay, I'm going to go through implications for special education. As I see them, this is where I'll put my sort of professional hat on and say, this is sort of my analysis and others who've been engaged in this work, specific to special ed. And I'm going to try to frame this as both impacts and opportunities. There are some opportunities in this transformation for improvement in special education, and I think that's important to highlight. It's certainly important for those of us in the field. So I'm going to run through these and then I'll stop sharing and we'll have time for questions. Okay, so the new and larger district structure. This is just fundamental change to the entire system of education. So by default, it's going to impact kids with disabilities because kids with disabilities are kids in Vermont schools. But there are some opportunities here for scale in particular. So a lot of times in Vermont, very small schools have trouble bringing in particularly technical services for kids with disabilities because they don't serve enough kids to make it worthwhile, or they are too far away from population centers to find people. So there is some opportunity in larger districts to have access to more shared services. So you might have some experts that are hired at the district level and are available to schools that wouldn't have been in our current structure. And that ability allows you to share resources, share expertise. You may even be able to give students themselves some broader experiences over a bigger geographic area. There were some things set into motion last year in the legislature with the bill around Board of Cooperative Education Services, which is a way of creating those structures without changing the district structure. a lot of the benefits are the same. With bigger districts, there's the potential for increased quality and consistency of services, and particularly the consistency piece. When you are a bigger system, the leaders in that system are working generally to say every kid in this district should have the same access to high quality services, and it just gives more opportunity for that. And I'm highlighting the positives because people are justifiably nervous around what this will look like. And I do think that this is a place where kids with disabilities can benefit. Implications, things to be concerned about specific to disability. Obviously, it's just the overall disruption to the public education system. This is big change that pulls the focus sometimes away from practice and kids. There are people who are engaged in the work who are worried about how those new district lines will be drawn. The task force, the majority of the task force in the law that passed is made up of legislators. And so the concern is that the political decisions, as opposed to education decisions, will drive what those new districts are. And then anytime you have scale, and I would say, this is putting my professional hat on, scale has a lot of benefits. There is research to support increased scale. And there is a point at which you lose that benefit and the scale is too big and decisions are so far from the student that it makes it challenging. So those are some things to be aware of specific to special ed. Foundation formula. I wanted to put this slide in to give some information about what's in the current law. And then I'll talk about the potential, the question, opportunities and implications for this. So special education will be funded differently in a foundation formula. It will be funded by calculating an additional weight to put on top of the base spending amount. So 15,033 is the base amount that every single student in a district would receive that amount of money. And then it's multiplied, specific to special ed, it's multiplied by your disability category. This is how the categories shake out. Category A is defined as specific learning disability or speech and language impairment, and that is a multiplier of 0.79. Category B is emotional disturbance, intellectual disability, developmental delay, or other health impairment. That multiplier is 1.89. Category C, autism spectrum disorder, deafblindness, hearing impairment, orthopedic impairment, traumatic brain injury, or visual impairment. I'm going to assume they also put, oh, they did. Okay. I was wondering if they missed deafblind. That is a multiplier of 2.49. Functionally, that means if I am a student with deafblindness, then the amount of money that the district will receive in support of my education is 15,000 times 2.49. Right now, there is not an additional extraordinary cost mechanism in this new funding structure. In Vermont right now, we have one. So if an individual student costs more than a certain amount of money, then the state reimburses the district at an almost 100% rate. And that would not happen in this new model. You'll see in my next slide, that's one of the concerns specific to special education. The other thing to understand is that there has not been a lot of modeling about what this will actually look like. And that's because the districts don't exist yet. So it's a little bit hard to predict exactly what a district will receive for all of the special ed students that it is responsible for teaching. And I would say that most of all of the education organizations have expressed concern about this, about the adequacy of a model that funds special education this way, because there really is no mechanism for receiving additional money. So, couple things. What are some opportunities around this? It's really hard to think about opportunities when you're talking about worrying about whether or not there's enough money. One of them, though, is that funding is not contingent on voter approval. We do know, one of the things that we know we have to resolve in Vermont is sometimes a community's desire for low taxes is what decides your budget. And so in this new model, That's not part of the conversation anymore. You receive the money you receive. There's increased equity across the state. We have a lot of inequity right now. We have towns and communities in Vermont who vote for low tax rates, and then that lowers and underfunds education. So this would eliminate that. The weights are based on research. They are based on modeling on the delivery of special education services. One of the things that I also think is true is that anytime it's based on research, you are assuming that best practices are in place. And we have some work to do in Vermont to make sure that those best practices are in place. So those are some opportunities. Obviously, the implications are concern about statewide underfunding of special education. One of the questions that we got was, what happens for kids with complex needs whose cost to educate may be higher than the amount that district receives? And one answer to that question, as you know, is special education is an entitlement. So that student still has to receive their services. If they cost more than the amount of money that the district receives, then the general ed side of the budget will have to bear those costs. So that's one of the concerns around special education. I'm going to talk in a second about advocacy because one of the questions was around this. I would say a few things to I hope make people feel better. One is there is an acknowledgement that we don't know the impact. The legislature, I would say, has acknowledged that they don't fully understand the impact of special education. And in these intervening years between now and the new district structure, they want to study whether or not those disability category weights are the most appropriate way to fund. So there is room for additional input and study. And that is where I would point folks who are thinking about how can we advocate. Yes, this law was passed, and one of the things in the law is that there will continue to be an expert panel that looks at special ed funding, not just special ed funding, all of the weights. So there is room to inform this moving forward. It's just that this version of the law puts it into place. And this would be in place if nothing else happens. Class size minimums, opportunities. I believe as an educator, there's a lot of opportunities here. It's really hard to provide robust instruction in very small classes. The things we do to teach kids, especially the things we do to accommodate instruction for kids who learn differently, it involves mixed grouping, and it involves sometimes working with a small group and sometimes a large group. Quality instruction is really hard in very small class sizes. So I do believe as a professional that there are some opportunities there. Increased scale also provides more robust peer opportunities, especially for kids with disabilities. Very small schools and very small class sizes creates one peer group, and that peer group, kind of stays together all the way, and that can be wonderful, and sometimes it can be challenging. So I do think there's some instructional opportunities with bigger class sizes. Obviously, the implications, and people who've been involved in this process know the biggest implications are for small rural schools. If you have fewer students, you're going to have a hard time having bigger class sizes. And that that impacts the future of those small schools. So there's not very many words to describe a big implication there. Special education study. I believe this is a big opportunity to look closely at special education. I'm not sure that special education delivery has ever really been studied deeply this way. And so there's an opportunity. There's an opportunity to have focused attention on making sure that all kids have services. I think lots of people on this call have experienced, especially over the past number of years, districts having trouble meeting their obligations, and being able to study that and have a plan is a good thing. Obviously, there's a lot of implications, though, about how a study is done. What will be the research perspective and the best practice perspective of the group studying special education? Are they looking to improve efficiency or quality? To be clear, the law asks them to look at quality and best practice. But it's hard to divorce the sort of public rhetoric around the cost of special education. And so that is something to be paying attention to. What will be the driving research behind it? Folks sort of in Vermont wonder about the capacity of the agency to conduct the study. The agency does receive additional support positions as a result of H454, but the special education study will already have been submitted before those positions really come online, because the study is due soon. So there's an overall question of it's a big study. If you read the law, there's a lot in there. So there's I think a realistic capacity question. Let me see if I had a couple of questions specific around this. I think this is related to those questions that were about just overall ability to meet the needs of complex students. This study and plan should help bring to light, if the funding isn't going to be adequate, this study should help reveal that. And I think that's an opportunity. Getting close to the end, very close to the end. And then I just sort of lumped all of these together specific to special ed because there's a lot of future work. One of the things that's true about this legislation is that it sets things into motion, but a lot doesn't happen for a little while. And so with all of these additional studies, I am optimistic that, or I hope that it will provide time to study these specific things. How much should it cost in Vermont for pre-K education? School construction needs to be part of this conversation. So they set some things into motion to study that. Looking at the foundation formula, they are putting in mechanisms to further study and make sure they have those numbers right. So that's a good thing. The studies put into motion are good things. Implications, Vermont has a bit of a track record of studying things and not necessarily doing anything with them. And I think that's one of the things to pay attention to, maybe one of the things to advocate for. What will happen after the study? What happens if we study the special ed funding and discover that it's not sufficient? What will the legislature then do with that? And then one of the things that's hardest for, certainly for people on the school side to plan for, is that the entire bill is contingent on new districts. And we don't know yet what those new districts look like. And that makes it hard to get ready, makes it hard to create a ramp for implementation. Okay, I rarely talk at people for that long without stopping.
Great, thank you.
But there was a lot of content.
That was great, Megan. Thank you so much for trying to help us understand better both the transformation process and then also the recent bill that was passed. And before we get to questions, I know there are already a few coming into the chat. We're going to just pause briefly to ask folks to complete a survey. And this really helps us to fulfill our grant requirements. So the link is in the chat. And we will just take a moment for you to do that for us.
I'm sorry, where's the link in the chat?
It was just entered, so it's right, should be the last
Oh,
thing.
gotcha.
Got it? Okay,
Yep.
Great. Thank you. Okay, so Megan, I think you got to just about all of the questions that were asked in advance. The one that I'm not sure about was the question around people tracking the numbers of families enrolled in home study, and maybe that will be part of the special education study that's going to be underway.
Yeah, I mean, the question was about sort of like, are we seeing changes in where families are choosing to educate their kids because of a lack of capacity in special ed? That's sort of my interpretation. And I don't know the answer to that. I do think there's potential for the special ed study looking at things like that. It may be something that some advocacy needs to be held to ask that the study address that.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I will take the first question that I see in the chat. And just so folks know, the workshop is scheduled to end at 4 o'clock. Megan has offered to stay until about 4:10. but we understand if you need to leave at 4 o'clock. So Greg entered a question here. What is the source of the foundation amount of $15,000 per student? So how did they come up with that amount?
So there were a lot of different versions of what the base amount would be over the course of January till now. The 15,000 did come from Dr. Tammy Colby's recommendation. So Tammy Colby has done a lot of work for Vermont. She's a researcher out of the University of Vermont and also studies funding across special ed funding across the country. And her model was the most robust of the ones studied, and it looked at how to in Vermont, based on current costs, what does it cost to educate a student? So that's where the 15,000 came for. There are a lot of mechanics to that calculation that I don't fully understand. What I would say, originally, the governor's proposal had that base amount at about 13,000 and had much lower weights. All of the weights in the current version, most of the weights in the current version are Dr. Colby's weights, and they are more robust. So that's an overview answer to that.
Can I ask a follow up on that?
Yep.
Is the 15,000 coming from local tax money, state tax money, or what?
Good question. They have not changed how we are taxed. So we will continue to have an education fund. The tax rates as an entire state, the differences are that they will be uniform. Obviously, they will vary based on the common level of appraisal and property value, the way that it already does. But other than that, it won't vary per community. It will only vary by your property value. It's a statewide rate, so the education fund will raise taxes and then the money will be distributed back out.
I was thinking about the political reaction to the whole thing, which was part of your presentation. Fantastic job, by the way. And I was thinking a lot of local people will be all for it if it's going to save them money. Right.
Yes.
And then I think that's going to happen in a lot of places. And that's kind of why I was asking if some of it is state money or local money, but less of it.
Yep.
It'll get a lot of support probably, right?
It's the same. It's still money raised by taxes. And I also would say one of the challenges with the legislation is some communities, the taxes will go up because those are communities that have traditionally opted for lower taxes. Now the services will also go up. Kids in those districts, again, we don't know what the districts are, but those kids will also receive more funding, which is a good thing, but the taxes will go up. And that was a point of discussion in the legislature.
Okay, we had another question on this same funding thread, asking about the weights and whether there was any difference between the weighting categories for someone on an IEP versus a 504, specifically for someone on the autism spectrum.
It's a very, very important question. There is no weight for students who are protected under Section 504. Are only weights for students with an IDEA or a special education disability. So if I am a student with autism and I have an IEP, I will receive the category 2 weight. I think it's 2, might be 3. You have to check my slides. If I am on a 504 and I have autism, I do not receive additional funding.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a really important question. I think that's probably something worth investigating in the because as with my professional hat, we also don't want to incentivize eligibility. We don't want to tie funding to eligibility because then it starts to cloud decisions about eligibility. And I know there's an if, people have lots of different experiences, but if my needs are adequately met with a 504 plan, then that's the right plan for me. And the fact that there may not be funding for me in that category, I wouldn't want schools to make a different eligibility decision because of funding. That was actually something we were trying to get away from with Act 173. So it's a really important question.
Okay, this one is a little bit of reading into your crystal ball. So given the history around implementation of Act 46 and Act 173, what is the likelihood of achieving implementation of H454 or on the current timeline? So some districts have had success delaying Act 46. What power would districts have to slow this down?
Yeah, great question. implementation that's the biggest challenge. If we don't make changes to how we deliver education, then any cost savings that you hope to gain isn't going to happen. What I would say, first of all, I think a lot hinges on what these new districts are going to be, because I don't know how palatable they will be, right? This task force is going to work on them. Then it goes to the legislature, and the legislature, and I think this past process has demonstrated that even when an external body exists to make recommendations, at the end of the day, it's the legislature who makes those decisions. That happened with the actual 454, and it will happen again with district lines. So I think one big hinge is what will happen with the districts. Now, the question about delaying, if there is a delay, it's the legislature that would control that, not individual districts. So right now, there really isn't a mechanism. If this goes into law, there's no mechanism for a district to delay. The legislature could fail to enact new district lines. And if they fail to enact new district lines, then the new funding model doesn't go into place, the new tax categories don't go into place, and essentially a lot of what we're currently doing just stays in place.
Okay, thank you. Kate poses a question that I think is related to the previous one about students on IEPs versus 504s. And her question is, if you suspect or we suspect that one of the outcomes of this process would be an increased urgency or buy-in for districts to do more evaluations.
I mean, I would say, again, this is one of the things for me, I don't believe finances should have anything to do with an eligibility decision. If a kid needs an IEP, they should have an IEP. And if they don't, they shouldn't have one, right? And for me, that again, that's one of the things when we move to a census-based grant, and this does not mean that this was implemented perfectly. I know people have lots of, there's a lot to be worked on in the referral process in Vermont, but it was meant to say, we used to, people would say in the original funding study a number of years ago that being eligible for special ed was an incentive because then you get 50 cents back on any dollar you spend on that student. So we didn't want that to be happening. So I don't know the answer, but it is certainly a potential that the district would be looking to make eligibility decisions. What I would also say is the way to remedy that is to focus on our eligibility process, because that is supposed to be an objective standalone process, and either you are eligible at the end of it or you're not. So if that process is implemented properly, then that would be how you make sure that you have the right kids identified and not kids who don't need to be identified. That's my perspective on that.
Thank you. Okay, we have a question from Elizabeth, and this one relates to the minimum number of hours of study per week that that hospital-bound or homebound students must complete, and that is outlined in the federal IDA, but the state sets the minimum hours. Would this law impact those hours in any way?
It shouldn't as it currently exists, because those minimums are in Vermont's special education law, and some of them are in Title 16, which is our general education law. And right now, this transformation bill does not impact either of those things. Now, if the special ed rules were opened up again, that would be a potential. But as far as I'm aware, as it currently stands, there's no reason why this law would impact those numbers.
Okay, thank you. Other questions?
I have one other. I didn't type it in, but
Go ahead, Greg.
yeah, thank you. Has anybody seen any kind of even a rough draft of new districts? What that might look like? That's gonna stir up some stuff.
I feel like there's probably a lot of napkins with that.
Yeah. I want to see the napkins.
There were There were actual, and these you can find on the legislature's website. Senate Education circled up around a certain number of them. At one point, some folks were looking at districts associated with tech centers in Vermont, so that would be 16 of them. There have certainly been different versions on the sort of public record.
Mhm.
And I'm guessing that those things will resurface for the task force. But I also suspect that there's just a whole lot of, I don't know, a whole lot of brainstorming behind the scenes. I
Yeah.
bet.
Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, we have another question. Could towns take the Lincoln-Ripton approach and upset the entire transformation process?
I would say it depends, right? Greg, isn't that how attorneys are supposed to answer that question? I think
Yeah.
functionally in this law, no, because right now, well, let me say it stepwise. Right now, it's this task force that will draw them, make recommendations to the legislature, and the legislature will, they have the authority to draw new district lines. Now, when they pass the law to draw those new district lines, will they bake in off-ramps, which is how Lincoln and Ripton and other districts like that? Act 46 allowed mechanisms for towns to withdraw. That's how some of these changes happened. That's not currently, there are no off-ramps in the current law, but it's the new legislature with those new lines and whatever they do with them that will determine that. So I would say right now, based on what we know, no. The answer to that would be no. But we don't really know because it's up to what the legislature does when they ultimately draw new district lines.
Megan, that makes me think of a question that I had, which is about the role of the State Board of Education, which you didn't really speak to here, but that's that sort of third body that, or, it's
Yep.
kind of hanging out there with some responsibilities. I was wondering how those may have changed or are staying the same in this bill.
Yeah, that's a great question because I didn't really adequately touch on that. There are changes to the state board or really tasking the state board with looking at some things. One of them is the state board will need to do basically a kind of an analysis of their current responsibilities, especially around rulemaking, and make some decisions about what should stay with them and what should not. The state board in this new law has a role as part of the process related to small schools. And then it also, I believe, receives some additional resources to be able to do some of this work. And then obviously the appointment structure is changed. In this journey, there were a lot of proposals and discussions about the state board role. One of which was they should no longer be responsible for rulemaking. And so in some ways, I would actually want to deep dive into the legislation to be more concrete about your question. They are still present. They are still responsible for essentially the oversight of education in Vermont. But the agency of education will have a strengthened role, particularly with some of the things that are in this law to unify delivery. So that's the calendar and things like that. So that's a bit of a vague answer to your question. They do still exist, and they have been asked actually to think about, and frankly, the commission's job, that's related to the commission's recommendations. So the commission that will continue, they may make recommendations about that very question.
Thank you. We have another question. Are there limitations in the law now for the new districts funding therapeutic schools? Or is that be more resolved after the special ed study?
So I would answer it a couple of different ways. First of all, the special ed study has some specific things it has to report on related to therapeutic schools. And it has like, what is their delivery? How many kids attend? How many of those kids are eligible for special education? What are the outcomes? So in fact, a good portion of the study in this law, the current version, is actually to go deeper into therapeutic schools. And so I do think that that study will reveal more information about therapeutic schools. I would say, just having observed the process, there's a recognition in the legislature that right now, first of all, that Vermont has trouble sometimes with the continuum of placements for special ed, and that right now therapeutic schools, which are independent, are almost the only option. And so there is a desire, I think, to make sure that that option, and that option right now can be really costly. So if you do the math on the weighted amount of money, that is a far smaller number than the tuition to some of these therapeutic schools. So I think there's a recognition that something needs to be done about that. And that either means finding a different way to have these placements or funding them differently. So I'm not sure that fully answered the question, but I would say that the study has a whole section on studying therapeutic schools as part of the special ed service delivery.
Okay, we have time probably for one more question. Are there any folks that would like to ask a question before we conclude our workshop?
It's not really a question, but I just, for grins, I looked at the per pupil amount for 2024, and it was 24,600. So it's a pretty ambitious ask, isn't it? To come down to 15,500 plus the multipliers. And I think that 24,600 was probably just your average kid. So yeah, it's a big shift. And if the scale stuff that you talked about, you know, the benefits of scale and all, would really need to kick in a big way for that to, you know, be viable in the long run. But
Yes.
but that's what's being looked at. It's ambitious for sure. But you point out that there's some opportunities for positive change too. So if that can all happen, it'd be great, you know. And I do just want to say, Meagan, thanks so much. You know, you bring a really you bring this crazy set of abilities and experience to a project like this, like your organizational skills and the way you break things down is really helpful for somebody like me. So thanks a lot for doing that.
Thanks,
And
Greg.
yeah,
Appreciate it.
and it's really nice that VFN is sponsoring too.
Greg, you took the words out of my mouth in my appreciation for Meagan and for being here. And, you know, I think we're all super grateful to have a voice in the wilderness a little bit.
Yeah.
And
she's chaired all these different
yes.
groups and everything almost effortlessly. It's like, if I tried to chair any one of those things, I would be just like so swamped and overwhelmed with it. But somehow she just manages it. It's really nice quality.
Thank you. And thank you for hosting this. This is big, important work. I think we're probably going to need a lot more opportunity to help people understand what this means. That was a part of the commission that was important to me. And I think there's going to have to be other ways of doing that because of the new role of the commission. I think not enough people actually really understand what this all means and how big it is. It's to your point, Greg, not just the financial point, but the whole thing. It's big.
Well, thank you again, Meagan, and thank you to everyone else for being here. And I think I heard maybe a volunteer offer to come back again if we need more explanation and opportunity, Meagan. So we may be calling you again soon. In the chat, I think is a reference to the fact that as we said earlier, this and all of our workshops are accessible on our YouTube channel. The link is on our website. And also on our site are lots of ways that families and professionals can connect with support and other resources. So, so thanks again, everyone. Stay cool, and we'll be in touch. Thank you.